None may challenge the Brotherhood.
By far, the most common comments I get on any of my Villainpedia videos is,
"That villain did nothing wrong, you big dumb idiot head."
Objection!
There are 0 villains I have made videos on that I would say did nothing wrong. Until right now. Well, kind of anyway. Because for Warcraft's Edwin VanCleef, I would say he did significantly less wrong than any villain covered to this point. Now, looking at the scope of something like World of Warcraft, there are obviously multiple, huge-scale villains hard at work seemingly at all times, with plans to take over the world, stab a big-ass sword into it, whatever shivers their timbers. But at its best, the world of Azeroth is a rich layer cake of narratives, big and small. I mean, to me, some of the most compelling storylines can be found by just reading quest text, following little plots in a random zone, or hopping in a dungeon. At least, this is true for the classic era of the game. The modern version of World of Warcraft is something narratively different altogether, but it's along those smaller threads back in the day that we find Edwin VanCleef, the final boss of the early game Alliance dungeon, the Deadmines. Not plotting to summon some world-eating demon or anything crazy like that, but just a guy who wants to see the corrupt nobility of the Kingdom of Stormwind toppled. A character that is emblematic of the eternal class struggle that has plagued human society for millennia. Because this is a man who was legitimately, and I mean legitimately, wronged on multiple fronts, and found himself an appointed leader during a fierce post-war labor dispute. But of course, with any good villain, nothing is ever so simple. You see, Edwin was, unbeknownst to him, being used as a pawn in a much grander game than his own. So, how did a hard-working and beloved stonemason turn into a bandit overlord? What was his plan with his brotherhood of ruffians and thieves, and why did all of his followers wear red? Well, before we get fully started here, I just want to take a moment to thank all of my lovely patrons who support me away from the tyranny of YouTube. You are all very much appreciated. If this by chance is your first time finding my channel and you enjoy character analysis, video game lore, game reviews, and other stuff like that, you have found yourself in the right place. I am Ghost, your host as always, and without further ado, let's don our red bandit masks, head for the gold mines of Westfall, and learn everything about the villain, Edwin VanCleef. You probably wouldn't be too surprised if I told you that this Warcraft villain's origins begin with a war. I know, it's kinda crazy, but the continent of the Eastern Kingdoms is a land that has a long history of it. I'm talking trolls, gnolls, dwarves, gnomes, humans, elves, and other races, long quarreling over territory and influence, you know, the usual. But it was often the advanced human, dwarf, gnome, and elf civilizations that came out on top. Until everything changed, and I mean everything, when after a long period of peace and prosperity, the alien orc invaders arrived through the dark portal from their homeworld of Draenor, bloodthirsty and searching for a new land to call their own. The Eastern Kingdoms at large were in an instant sent into panic, and a large-scale conflict known as the First War began. This was a bloody, messy thing, and it's what we see depicted in both the Warcraft movie, which I made a video on, as well as the first game in the entire series. The humans were, in a bad way, caught with their pants down. They had obviously not been preparing for such an epic war to just start out of nowhere on a Wednesday afternoon. So the orcs struck fast and hard, taking advantage fully of the element of surprise. They're also fucking huge and green. That's a pretty big advantage if you ask me. This war raged for several years, and at its climax, the capital of the southern kingdom of Stormwind was under siege. What was once a paradise for the humans was now a hell, and their prized city was destroyed and sacked as the orcs occupied and controlled the territory. The royal family and other survivors were forced to flee to the northern kingdom of Lordaeron. Many people died, and the humans attempted to regroup in hopes of recapturing their home one day. Eventually though, through the events of the Second War, aka Warcraft 2's story, they were able to do exactly that. Because with the formation of the Alliance of Lordaeron, the united races stood against the orcs, took back Stormwind, and for the moment, drove away the enemy. But the returning humans seemed to have a pretty big issue on their hands. Their entire city had been reduced to a pile of bricks. This wouldn't do it all, and all human kingdoms around the world saw rebuilding the city of Stormwind as a top agenda item. Because not only was it a key strategic location for future orc conflict and whatnot, but also a vital symbol of hope and reclamation for the human forces and people at large. But let's pause here with the big events and get tabs on our man. Because during this whole insane conflict, a young Edwin VanCleef was simply surviving. The details of his personal path to make it through such dangerous times are foggy at best, but I always want to know with a villain at the beginning of their life, who is this guy? Where did he come from? What did he come from? Well, sadly, much is shrouded in mystery regarding his upbringing as well, but what we do know is that in times of peace, Edwin had long called Stormwind home, and growing up was known as a roof walker. I always took this to mean he was no stranger to the underbelly of the world, and likely kept company with those with a nose for pickpocketing, tracking, and other roguish activities. Stinky little buggers, you know? But more on that later, because as a man, he had straightened out considerably, and was eventually a respected stonemason by trade, a profession that his father had mastered and passed down to him. Well, before the wars, not only was Edwin a good mason, he was one of the best, and had been appointed leader of the Stonemasons Guild, an organization of builders, sort of a union you could say, where they would share contracted work, look out for each other, and just generally have a sort of central body to communicate and make sure everyone was being treated well out there in the stone business, I guess. So it's very clear to me that Edwin, even at this early stage of his life, was charismatic. He was used to leading, and probably enjoyed being a guiding voice for a group of like-minded, hardworking people. Foreshadowing, perhaps? So yes, the war and all that, well, at whatever point Edwin returned home to find it obviously destroyed, so that sucks ass, sorry buddy. But even beyond Stormwind, this entire area of the continent was just in really rough shape. You know, it needed some TLC, some repairs, some fortifications and whatnot. So Edwin and some of his other guildmates were just simply regrouping, picking up the scraps of their old lives when they were tasked with a rather big job, building Netherguard Keep, a very, very important castle and outpost for the purpose of holding a constant watch on the Dark Portal. Obviously, at this point with all the orcs, you're gonna want to keep tabs on that shit, right? Well, that job went very well. So well, in fact, that the Stormwind House of Nobles took note of the craftsmanship and pitched to the workers a much larger gig to come rebuild the entire city of Stormwind. I mean, holy smokes, it seemed like a match made in heaven, right? The hardworking Stonemasons Guild returning to the rubble of their home and rebuilding their own capital, a really nice narrative for morale too, I think. So just like that, contracts were made up, rates agreed upon, and the deal was finalized. Or maybe not, because depending on who you ask, some say that the Stonemasons Guild just took it upon themselves to rebuild as a show of good faith. This is, needless to say, a key distinction in Edwin's life story that will come back up in a bit. But either way, no matter who said what and what agreed upon to who, Edwin was to take charge of the rebuilding of Stormwind, and doing so must have been an extremely proud moment for him. I mean, imagine how his daddy would feel if he could see him now. This is, very likely, I would say with confidence, the high point of Edwin's entire life. So as we like to do in these videos, let's do a little check-in, you know, on our villain. And I know we know very little so far, but Edwin seems like a pretty stand-up, normal, hardworking, blue-collar everyman, right? I don't detect many breadcrumbs of evil here. No shitty stonework to make a quick buck, no embezzling funds or abusing his workers, nothing like that. This is a guy that, again, seems rather normal. We would probably all enjoy grabbing a pint with him in Goldshire. Oh shit, maybe a different tavern. But he is proof that some villains can truly be transformed in an instant if crossed in just the right way at just the right time. So the task at hand was gargantuan, to say the least. It would not just take a crew, but an army of builders, planners, tinkers to construct the new vision that Edwin and other leaders had for the city. And beyond the established members of his guild, countless volunteers from the Eastern Kingdoms flocked to the project, seeing the restoration of Stormwind as either a noble cause to lend a hand, or a chance to cash in on some lucrative government cash. Also, the wars had changed things politically. The neighboring gnomes and dwarves were now closer allies than ever, and the city would need to reflect this in some way. So with so much to do, work began slowly, but would pick up considerably in pace until the project was completed in under 10 years, which, hey, that's pretty impressive. I mean, look at the size of this place. This truly was a no bullshit, no shortcuts, high quality executed operation. Stormwind was not only back, it was bigger, brighter, and better than ever, with an entire quarter dedicated to the dwarf and gnome homies, and a high-tech tram system built in tandem with the gnomes that could transport supplies, troops, and visitors between Stormwind and the dwarven city of Ironforge in the blink of an eye. I mean, the work of Edwin and the Stonemasons Guild was pretty much universally loved and praised. All right, well, all Edwin had to do now was wash his hands, have a snack, collect payment for himself, the workers, and then take a much-deserved vacation. But here we come to the largest turning point in Edwin's life story. Because when the guild communicated that work was complete and they were ready to throw a party and cash out, the Stormwind House of Nobles refused to pay. They even came to Edwin and a few others offering them government positions to just hush the whole thing up and move on, say fuck the other workers. Well, VanCleef enthusiastically refused.
My disappointment is immeasurable. And my day is ruined.
Uh-oh. This is not gonna go well, man. I mean, imagine the shock that probably came over Edwin and all of the workers. They thought that they were all in this together. You know, a project of a lifetime, nearly a decade dedicated to this work, and now the people who did the actual work are gonna be left hungry? No matter how you slice it, that is not cool. Well, apparently, the House of Nobles was split. Some of them claimed that there was simply no money in the treasury left. I mean, the city was recently destroyed after all, and war is an expensive pastime. The Alliance had been splurging to fortify their military presence in the east and the south, so they said, listen, we're in too much debt, I'm sorry, but there's no money to give you guys. But other nobles claimed that this was expected to be a project for the good of the people, charity, essentially, and that the builders should not expect a coin. But meanwhile, all of the workers universally thought they were at least gonna get something. Of course, Edwin was at the center of this dispute, acting as the voice of his guild and representing all of those who dedicated their time to the building of the city. Everyone on either side was furious. I mean, what the hell? How could there be such a massive miscommunication? Well, at the top of the video, I mentioned that Edwin was a pawn in a game bigger than he realized. So let me introduce you to a woman known as Lady Katrana Prester, a high-ranking noblewoman within Stormwind that had a powerful and influential voice amongst her peers. Well, over the years, Lady Prester had used a little dark magic here and there to, let's just say, influence the quality of some of the stonemasons' work in tiny ways. She would then point out these little flaws to her fellow nobles, noting how kind of poopy the work was, and maybe they should have selected better builders, and generally just poisoned many around her against the stonemasons. But when this dispute arose, she was also communicating with Edwin and the guild, telling them not to budge on their demands. Dig in, guys, like you should even ask for more money, you worked hard and deserve that coin. She was playing both sides, but she was careful to only influence about half of the nobles and half of the workers to ensure that even amongst each other, compromise would never come, riling up a fight masterfully from nothing and generally causing a fucking mess. So why? Who are you? Why you doing this to my man Edwin? Well, it is actually one of the biggest villains in the entire franchise in disguise. Onyxia of the Black Dragonflight and the daughter of Deathwing himself. This is her human form, and in it, she caused all sorts of problems beyond this. Her personal goal was eventually to try to take over Stormwind and assist her brother, who was doing all kinds of stuff in the nearby Blackrock Mountain. But that's a story for another day. What we care about right now is that her agenda is directly responsible for things becoming so contentious around Edwin VanCleef. She perfectly played all of these humans like an absolute fiddle and watched gleefully as the disagreement grew increasingly tense. So you might be wondering, what about the overall leadership here, right? The royals? Well, the king, a very young Varian Rin, attempted to make peace of this situation, but the corruption of Lady Prester had already done its work. Funds were legitimately low, and he struggled to find a middle ground that worked for anyone involved. It didn't help that he was like in his 20s and just now learning what it takes to be a king. The queen, however, Tiffin, had long sympathized with the Stonemasons Guild and acted as an advocate for their getting just payment, but again, it was too little, too late. Their hands were tied. Everything had been masterfully messed up so bad. So next, in a desperate attempt to end the dispute, the House of Nobles did something I consider to be extremely stupid. They ordered the Stonemasons Guild to disband permanently right now or face the consequences. Oh boy. What resulted from this order should not surprise anyone. Riots in the streets led by Edwin VanCleef. The Masons all felt that if the work they did was not going to be respected and they were not going to receive compensation, they were absolutely content burning it all back down to the ground again. Hey, nobles, you can build it yourself. But these riots soon turned more violent, angry, and chaotic. The city guards were forced to meet their violence with violence, and all of a sudden, we got an absolute Donnybrook breaking out here. But in the madness, the king and queen looked on horrified, and Tiffin spoke up to try to calm the crowd, when something extremely unfortunate occurred. A stray stone flung by a protester hit Queen Tiffin in the skull, resulting in a serious wound that would take her life. Meanwhile, Edwin rallied his workers and attempted to push further towards Stormwind Keep, but when the queen fell, a devastated King Varian took more drastic action. The stonemasons were now facing deadly resistance, people were dying, and they were forced to retreat. With Edwin leading them, they headed out of the city gates and into the night to live to fight another day. Now, a small side note, one of Edwin's closest allies named Basil Thread was captured in this melee and thrown in the Stormwind stockades. That ends up being like a whole other subplot line where he and other Defias and stinky dudes are trying to cause a riot and hurt Stormwind from within. I mean, it's not super relevant to this, but I just wanted to at least mention it. Now, regardless of Edwin's legit claim that he and his guild were wronged, they had just literally murdered the queen. So Edwin knew that they were kind of screwed. You know, they were never going to be going home again, and they were not going to sniff any sort of payment. They were essentially an enemy of the king, probably top of the list too. So damn, I mean, what a turn of events, right? What should have been a time of celebration, unity, and some peace turned into corruption, infighting, violent riots, and one dead queen. This is why you always make sure you can pay your workers fairly. So this is a perfect time to pause again and do our second little villain check-in. And I think regarding Edwin VanCleef, it is very important to remember that 99.9% of all characters and people are not the super noble hero type, right? There are only so many of those to really go around. Most of us are just normal, flawed and nuanced, assuming the writing in the game is any good, that is. And I think Edwin firmly falls into that 99%. Sure, he was never a bad guy before this, but he wasn't a particularly good, selfless guy either, from what we know anyway. Just a person with a certain set of skills. And it really does not take much to push the average human down a dark path. Perhaps an Edwin in another universe would have been able to calm his guildmates down, take the high road and find a more diplomatic solution here. But at the end of the day, he just isn't that guy. Most of us aren't. You probably are not, I'm probably not. And Edwin now is truly crestfallen. He felt that the world had cheated him, that the systems he once looked up to were thoroughly corrupt, and that it would always be the common people that would suffer in situations like this, never those with wealth and influence. He was just completely done. Add in the Onyxia corruption, and it's a perfect storm for a once hardworking artisan to be turned into an outlaw in a single afternoon. I also think, and this is important too, that many average people, like Edwin, are looking to have a sense of purpose. And for him, that purpose presented itself when all those he had known and worked with for literally years rallied behind him as their leader in that moment. I mean, regardless of the situation, it must feel good to look around at all those people behind you, seeing you as the face of a movement. Evil is a slippery slope, man. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. One man's hero, another's villain. Well, at this point, the band is on the run, and Edwin took his crew into the rural fields of Westfall to hide out, cutting down or scaring away local farmers who stood in their way, because across the board, there was now this unshakable anger, almost a bloodlust, a hatred within these men and women towards Stormwind. They next made their way for the gold mines under Westfall, and VanCleef declared a particularly large mine under the town of Moonbrook in the south, the guild's new hideout. This would eventually be Edwin's seat of power, the Dead Mines, where he would brood and scheme up ways to strike blows at Stormwind whenever he could. He had obviously committed high treason and would have to lay low for the rest of his life, but Edwin was no stranger to the skills of subterfuge. Remember, at the beginning when we talked about him being a roof walker as a kid, learning the tricks of the trade, stealing candy from the 7-Eleven? Well, to add a bit more context, he was a childhood friend of one Matthias Shaw, the man who would end up being spy master and leader of the SI-7 in Stormwind, which is essentially the FBI. And it was Matthias who trained Edwin and taught him everything he knew of the roguish world back then. So he was very well equipped to evade authorities, secure supplies illegally, train up his members in the same manner, and plan revenge. There was no going back now, and at this moment, the Defias Brotherhood was officially born. Masons set down their tools in favor of daggers and cutlasses, adorned themselves with red bandanas to symbolize the blood of the oppressed people at the hands of the nobility. Mechanical monstrosities were constructed in league with the goblins to terrorize the locals of Westfall, and over time, the influence and anger of the Defias would spread far and wide. So Edwin's original plan for the Brotherhood was pretty simple. If they weren't going to be paid, they would amass the wealth they were owed by robbing traders and travelers outside of Stormwind, always staying in the shadows out of sight, and along the way, attempting to expose and take down the House of Nobles, their mortal enemy. But as months turned into years, Edwin and his Brotherhood's ideals strayed further and further from their kind of noble beginnings. Their ranks grew to include pirates, outcasts, thieves, murderers, and runaways. I mean, what started as a fractured group of tradesmen had transformed into a legitimately full-on criminal operation. And Edwin sought to expand Defias' influence constantly, working in tandem with Riverpaw Gnolls, Bloodsail Buccaneers, some sects of Naga, and kobolds. Ew, dude, why would you want to work with those little goobers? I mean, damn it. Because of his past in Stormwind and his experience as a Mason, he had some serious connections. And that is a huge key to his villainy as well, that he is an extremely resourceful guy all throughout, and turned very, very little into a small criminal empire hell-bent on Stormwind's downfall.
Impressive. Very nice.
Well, eventually, you got Defias in Elwyn, Westfall, Duskwood, and even beyond, and they were seen as one of the biggest legitimate threats facing the kingdom. The more the Defias caused trouble and stretched Stormwind's guard thin, the weaker the city became, and all the while, he oversaw the construction of a big-ass boat in his Deadmines grotto. But not just any boat. A juggernaut vessel akin to those the orcs take to the seas. A crude, massive thing with enough firepower to park right off the coast and give Stormwind hell when everything fell into place. His plans were coming together, and he always seemed to be just out of reach of the king. So, whew, alright. I mean, that is a lot of backstory for an early game dungeon boss, right? And I just think it's so good. I love it. The upper and lower class division is truly the stuff of legend when it comes to villains on both sides. And again, it's all a matter of your perspective, right? There are of course many characters within the lore, and probably some of you at home, that view Edwin VanCleef as their only hope for a better world. But as every villain has a rise to power, they too must fall. So, what is Edwin up to for us as a player in World of Warcraft? What can we do to stop him? And of course, we always must ask the eternal question, why does he ultimately fail? One of the great things about vanilla World of Warcraft is that you, the player, are nothing special. You're not given artifacts of legend willy-nilly, you're not standing shoulder to shoulder with kings and queens. You are just an adventurer, an average Joe making your way through Azeroth, learning about the world, and assisting where it pleases you. Well listen, I'ma keep it really real with you. Growing up, and to this day, I much prefer playing as the Horde. I mean, if given the choice to be a big green man, a cow, a dead guy, or NBA draft prospect Chet Holmgren, I'm taking those over being anything on the Alliance every day of the week. But many people disagree with me there, as humans are always the most played race in the entire game at all times, or so it seems. Well, pardon the tangent, but it is relevant, because if you start as a human, you start in the lap of Edwin VanCleef and the Defias Brotherhood. Even within the baby zone, before you head out into the world, you are introduced to them as adversaries clearly marked by their red Defias masks. And this is really the main function of Edwin and the Defias overall, mechanically speaking. A little thread for human and Alliance players early in their adventure to visually pick up on, and then over time build up a desire to investigate and learn more about who those red-masked people are. It's admittedly very simple design-wise, but it's clever, and obviously the character and faction have successfully etched themselves in the fandom's long-term memory. I mean, I think that's because it's all presented very clearly. Because as you level, so too do the Defias. You almost seem to be moving up their food chain as you increase in power. You go from facing Defias thugs, to bandits, to ambushers, to highwaymen, to the dreaded pillagers that kill you in like 3 hits. You really feel yourself following those breadcrumbs toward something, or toward someone. And I think the majority of players are keen on learning a little bit more, finding the source of these red bandanas, and I really like it. I think it's good gameplay storytelling. Well, if you are playing Alliance, you are absolutely destined to end up in Westfall for an extended period of time while leveling. This, of course, is the region where Edwin brought his band of merry thieves to hide out. But it's very important to note that the people within World of Warcraft at this time do not connect the name Edwin VanCleef with the threat of the Defias. It is an unknown thing. Well, to you, as a player, it's immediately obvious that the Defias run this bitch when you show up. And this is made even more clear when you head to the area known as Sentinel Hill and speak with an old wizened paladin named Gryan Stoutmantle. This poor son of a bitch is the member of the Silver Hand that has the very unfortunate title of Marshal and Enforcer of Westfall. Yikes, worst job ever. Obviously, things are not going well for him here at all. Due to the corruption of the nobility, Lady Prester doing her thing, and no money in the Stormwind vaults, Westfall has received almost zero aid in regards to the Defias taking over everything. So Stoutmantle has taken it upon himself to rally the locals, pig farmers, housewives, cows, dogs, cats, anyone who could lend a hand to join the People's Militia, a kind of grassroots effort to purge the area of danger. And let me tell you, you are exactly what the doctor ordered for old Stoutmantle. An eager, capable adventurer willing to do mindless slaughtering for silver coins and a few experience points. Well, you and the other millions of people doing the quest, you ain't that special. But what follows is a nice little quest chain, I'm gonna be honest. It starts out with you just wiping out various groups of Defias that stand around in various areas of Westfall. But soon it turns into a little bit more. You're being sent to the Red Ridge Mountains, meeting with secret contacts, and even hearing word from Matthias Shaw himself of SI7. And slowly but surely, everything we have talked about in the backstory comes into scope for the player. The history of the stonemasons, the riots, the disputes, and one name emerges: Edwin VanCleef. A captured Defias traitor confirms that he is indeed their leader and points us players toward the hideout. Ah yeah, the path is clear, we have cut through his ranks, gathered necessary lore, and now have a mark on the map. It's time to kill Edwin VanCleef. However, it's just funny to me. All these amazing lore characters in Warcraft, and any MMO for that matter, with these epic feuds and all this writing, but it's always a group of just random-ass strangers dressed in kind of clown-ass outfits coming in and killing them with little fanfare, rinse, and repeat. It's kind of a wet blanket on all the badass backstory we just covered, but hey, it's a quirk of the MMO genre, I suppose. Well, of course, you must gather your party before venturing forth, and once you are finally ready to brave the Deadmines dungeon, the full power of Edwin VanCleef is fully on display. Every boss in here is in some way representative of his Brotherhood's influence. You got an ogre, some goblins, murlocs, engineers, pirates. Again, really impressive how much he built out this movement in the last 20 or so years. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I almost feel bad coming in here and fucking it all up. So fighting through to the end will at last bring you to his pet project, the Dreadnought. And atop the vessel, at long, long last, we can come face to face with the Master Stonesmith himself.
None may challenge the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood.
So it is here, in a dark cave on a massive war machine with all of his friends and followers slain around him, that Edwin at last meets a quiet end. We then take his head back to Stoutmantle as proof of his demise. I believe ultimately that Edwin VanCleef fails because he flew too close to the sun with all of his ambitions. He accidentally rallied the people of Westfall and attracted adventurers like us, who were more than capable of tracking him down and kicking his ass. But this is a man who legitimately thought he was doing the right thing to his last breath, standing up to the bullies of the world, and was making it a better place by taking Stormwind down. But one thing that always disappointed me, and does right now, you can probably tell in my voice, is how anticlimactic this encounter is. I mean, we don't even really get to hear from Edwin. He's a man of like 19 total words, but we are given such an interesting backstory. I always wanted him to come out of his quarters here at the end of the Deadmines and pitch to us why we should join him or something, you know? You'd think they would at least give him that, one last opportunity to talk his way out of death and gain some more powerful allies. I don't know, it just always has felt like kind of a letdown or a missed chance to deepen this character a little bit more. But hey, I understand, because ultimately, this is an early game dungeon boss from vanilla World of Warcraft, of which there are dozens. Yes, his backstory happens to be amazing, but I bet 90% of players rolled in here with Darude Sandstorm pumped up over the game audio to get their loot and rolled out. Again, so it goes. But I just can't help but imagine Edwin as a character in a game like Warcraft 3. Oh, man. Where we would really get to hear his perspective on the world and his half of what happened back in Stormwind, because remember, history is always written by the victor. But regardless of the anticlimactic encounter, I think it's really the backstory that shines here, and it shines bright. Edwin not only stands out amongst other minor Warcraft villains, but just video game minor villains at large. Of course, he has become one of the most memorable simply because he is the head honcho of an early game enemy faction in the most popular starting zone in the game, so he's kind of enjoyed that massive amount of exposure, even to casual players, for years. But for anybody who has ever dug deeper and read the quests, learned the story and motivations of Edwin, it really is clear that he's a bit of a unique bad guy for Warcraft. A sort of dark Robin Hood, who at one point had somewhat pure intentions but slid down the slide of evil a little bit too fast and found himself a kingpin of a pretty dastardly operation. So now some just little additional notes about his legacy, his impact on the game overall. Well, over the years, Edwin has become a legendary rogue. And of course, Rogue is one of the playable classes for us in World of Warcraft. And his design, his unique set of abilities, is what inspired the Outlaw Rogue specialization, which was added to the game with the expansion Legion. It's kind of that classic swashbuckling pirate type rogue that I think Edwin really well embodied. Players also saw him pop up during the Wrath of the Lich King in the Trial of the Champion dungeon, in which players are facing memories from other characters' pasts. And a small thing about his name, VanCleef. Well, Lee VanCleef was a famous Western film actor who often played villains that were kind of similar to Edwin. Sour-ass outlaws that had some reason to be pissed off at the world. Additionally, of course, he appears in Hearthstone as a legendary card for the Rogue set, as well as a purchasable hero for the Rogue class. So his legacy is undeniable. Of course, I have to mention that dastardly operation did not die with Edwin. He set several things in motion that continued on, with Defias sympathizers within the House of Nobles, as well as a plot to have King Varian Wrynn captured in Dustwallow Marsh. Then, a few years later, a new Defias leader even took his place. You see, Edwin had a daughter, Vanessa, in secret, who would grow into the new boss post-Cataclysm. She led the Brotherhood through new challenges with new plans and plots for Stormwind's demise, and for some reason, she refuses to put on a damn pair of pants. But that is indeed a character for another time, because for Edwin VanCleef, his story, his legacy, is tragic. He had many perfectly good reasons to do the things that he did. He stood on principles of hard work, honesty, community, but was manipulated by one much wiser than he. At the end of the day, his greatest weakness is that he was just an average man, susceptible to the basic human emotions conjured by the dealings of Lady Prester. Add in the lack of payment from the nobles and his desire to represent his fellow workers honorably, he was primed for a fall. He gave everything to his home city, to really see it shine and be a beacon for all humans around the world, but the cold shoulder he got in return forever darkened his heart. From hard-working stonemason to working-class hero to enemy of the free people of Stormwind, Edwin VanCleef, for a minor villain, made quite a mark on the World of Warcraft. And over the years, he has become one of the poster boys for villains that did nothing wrong. Thank you so much everyone for watching and or listening to the end. I greatly appreciate it as always. Who knew that such a small character could have such a great backstory and mechanical function within a game so massive? It's so easy to skip over a villain like Edwin VanCleef and dismiss him, but I assure you, there are always interesting tales to be told. Always. Shout out to my patrons once again and all of you who have subscribed, watched, liked, all that jazz. And until next time, peace.